At 500 feet above the Sea of Tranquility, Neil Armstrong's fuel pressure gauge dropped into the red, and humanity's first attempt to land on the moon ended in the screaming burn of an ascent engine. The date was July 20, 1969. For 8 years, America had spent $25 billion and mobilized 400,000 workers toward this single moment. And now Armstrong was staging the descent module and firing upward, away from the gray dust that had been seconds from receiving human footprints. Buzz Aldrin called out altitude readings as the lunar surface fell away beneath them, the abort sequence executing exactly as they had trained, exactly as no one had ever wanted to use it. The fuel pressure anomaly had given Armstrong no choice. Below certain margins, the descent engine could flame out entirely, stranding the Eagle in a slow-motion crash. The abort was textbook, the execution was flawless, and none of that mattered to the 600 million people watching on Earth, who only knew that the landing they had waited years to witness would not happen today. What no one understood yet, what would take months to fully emerge, was how this single mechanical failure would reshape the entire trajectory of the space race. In this alternate timeline exploration, we examine what could have happened and why the real history unfolded differently. Michael Collins, alone in the command module Columbia, had been tracking the Eagle's descent when the telemetry suddenly changed. The abort call came through crisp and professional, Armstrong's voice betraying nothing. Collins adjusted his orbit to intercept the ascending lunar module, his training overriding any shock he might have felt. Within hours, the two spacecraft would dock again, and the crew would begin the long journey home. They were alive. The mission had failed. The splashdown in the Pacific, 3 days later, carried none of the triumphant energy NASA had envisioned. The crew of Apollo 11 emerged healthy and smiling from their spacecraft, but the smiles were thin. President Nixon met them aboard the recovery ship, his prepared remarks hastily rewritten to celebrate survival rather than conquest. The astronauts spent their quarantine period answering technical questions about the abort, while Congress began asking questions of its own. Senator Walter Mondale of Minnesota had opposed Apollo spending for years, arguing that the money could serve Americans better on Earth. The abort handed him a weapon. Within 2 weeks, his subcommittee announced hearings on NASA's quality control and mission readiness procedures. Thomas Paine, the NASA administrator, found himself defending not just the agency's past decisions, but its entire future. The $25 billion already spent now looked less like an investment and more like a sunk cost. Nixon faced a political calculation his predecessors had never confronted. Kennedy had promised the moon. Johnson had funded the promise. Now Nixon had inherited a program that had just publicly failed its first real test, and polling showed that American enthusiasm for space spending had been declining since 1966. But canceling Apollo entirely would mean surrendering to the Soviets. The president authorized Apollo 12 to proceed while privately demanding assurances from Paine that America would not be humiliated again. In the Soviet Union, the American abort was received with cautious optimism and immediate pressure. The Politburo had never publicly acknowledged that cosmonauts were training for lunar missions, maintaining the fiction that their space program focused only on scientific research. But Vasily Mishin, the chief designer who had inherited the program after Korolev's death, knew exactly what his masters wanted. They wanted a Soviet boot on lunar soil before the Americans recovered their nerve. The problem was the N1. The massive rocket had failed 3 times already, most recently just 16 days before Armstrong's abort. Each failure had destroyed the vehicle in spectacular fashion, scattering debris across the Kazakh steppe. Mishin had been begging for more testing time, more resources, more patience. The abort changed everything. Now the Politburo saw opportunity where Mishin saw only danger. Alexei Leonov, the cosmonaut who had performed the first spacewalk in 1965, had been training for years as commander of the lunar landing crew. He understood both the possibility and the risk. If the Americans stumbled long enough for a 5th N1 to work, he might become the first human to walk on another world. If the Politburo rushed Mishin too hard, he might become another name on the list of cosmonauts killed by impatience. But the consequences of Moscow's decision would not become clear for months. First, America would have its chance to recover. NASA scheduled Apollo 12 for November 1969, 4 months after the abort. Pete Conrad would command, with Alan Bean and Richard Gordon rounding out the crew. The agency had traced the fuel pressure anomaly to a manufacturing defect in a valve assembly, and every lunar module in the pipeline underwent additional inspections. Payne staked his reputation on the assertion that Apollo 12 would succeed. On November 14, 1969, Apollo 12 sat on Pad 39A at Kennedy Space Center, fully fueled and ready. Conrad, Bean, and Gordon were strapped into their couches, and then the Florida weather, which had been marginal all morning, deteriorated past acceptable limits. Lightning crackled across the Cape. Flight Director Jerry Griffin made the call: scrub the launch. The mission would try again in December. To the engineers, a weather scrub was routine, a sensible safety decision that protected crew and vehicle alike. To the watching world, it was another American failure. The Soviets made no public comment, but their propaganda organs noted with satisfaction that the moon remained unconquered. In Houston and Washington, frustration mounted. The December window came and went with more weather delays. Apollo 12 would not launch until January 1970, half a year after Armstrong's abort. The Soviet N-1 rocket stood nearly as tall as the American Saturn V, but it relied on 30 engines in its first stage rather than 5. This complexity had been the program's undoing. Controlling 30 engines simultaneously pushed the limits of 1960s technology, and each previous launch had ended in catastrophic failure. Mishin had pleaded for more ground testing. The Politburo had given him a deadline instead. On December 15, 1969, the fourth N-1 rose from the Baikonur Cosmodrome. For 90 seconds, everything worked. The first stage performed its job, and the massive vehicle climbed through the Soviet sky. Then came staging, the moment when the first stage separated and the second stage ignited. It was supposed to be a smooth transition. Instead, it became a fireball. The second stage engines failed to ignite properly, sending the vehicle tumbling. Explosive charges destroyed the rocket before it could crash uncontrolled, scattering wreckage across kilometers of empty steppe. There were no casualties, but there was also no disguising the failure. Soviet secrecy kept the news from reaching the West, but within the Kremlin, patience was wearing thin. Mishin had one more chance. If the fifth N-1 failed, the Soviet lunar program might be cancelled entirely. Apollo 12 finally launched on January 14, 1970. This time, the weather cooperated. The Saturn V performed flawlessly, hurling Conrad, Bean, and Gordon toward the moon. 4 days later, Conrad guided the lunar module Intrepid down to the ocean of storms, landing within walking distance of the Surveyor 3 probe that had touched down years earlier. His first words on the surface were a triumphant shout that echoed through mission control. America had reached the moon. The 6-month gap between abort and success had been painful, but the flag now standing in lunar soil erased much of that pain. Nixon addressed the nation with genuine enthusiasm, positioning the landing as vindication of American perseverance. Senator Mondale found his opposition suddenly less popular. The public, it turned out, still thrilled to success, but the Soviets were not ready to concede. Within days of the Apollo 12 splashdown, Moscow announced plans for a lunar research station mission before the end of 1970. Western analysts recognized this for what it was, an acknowledgement that cosmonauts would attempt their own landing. The race was not over. It had simply changed shape. The fifth N-1 launched on February 24, 1971, 19 months after Armstrong's abort. Mission had spent every moment since the fourth failure redesigning the engine control systems, testing components until they functioned with mechanical precision. This time, the first stage worked. The second stage worked. The third stage placed the vehicle in Earth orbit, and the mission proceeded toward the moon. Alexei Leonov and Oleg Makarov rode the spacecraft around the moon and into lunar orbit. The landing craft, smaller than the American lunar module but functional, separated and began its descent. Soviet controllers in Crimea watched telemetry with something between hope and terror. The descent engine fired steadily. The altitude dropped, and then Leonov's voice crackled through the static. Contact. A Soviet cosmonaut stood on the moon. Leonov planted a hammer and sickle flag 40 meters from where his landing craft sat, silent, on the gray regolith. He spoke words that Moscow had prepared, praising socialist achievement and international peace. But the moment belonged to him, a man who had trained for this since before Yuri Gagarin's flight. When he returned to Earth, he was the most celebrated Soviet citizen since Gagarin himself. The moon, by the end of 1973, bore the marks of both superpowers. America completed 6 successful landings, culminating in Apollo 17's exploration of the Taurus-Littrow Valley. The Soviet Union managed 3, with their program plagued by reliability problems that never fully disappeared. Both nations left flags in the dust. Both nations brought back rocks, and both nations eventually decided that the expense could not continue. Nixon ended Apollo after the 17th mission, redirecting funds toward a space station and a reusable shuttle. The Soviet program collapsed more quietly, its failures hidden behind official silence until Glasnost revealed the full story decades later. The moon became a monument to what both nations had achieved and what neither could sustain. History might have been simpler if Armstrong's descent engine had held its pressure for another 5 minutes. America would have claimed the moon alone, the undisputed winner of a race the Soviets would later deny entering. Instead, the abort created a gap, and into that gap stepped Alexei Leonov, a cosmonaut who had been ready for years. The moon remembers no politics. It holds its flags and footprints with equal indifference, waiting beneath the same ancient silence for whoever might return.